Hi everyone, and welcome to March's Tea Break. I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm the Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency, and we're going to be talking about travel in this month's session. For the purposes of description, I am a white male with a blurred background for a change, and blonde hair and a blue top. And I'm joined by my colleague Zoe, who will be doing a bit of a response um, to what I have to say later on. So Zoe, if you want to say a quick hello and introduction.
Hi everybody. It's really nice to see a few familiar names on the guest list. And I work as the Director of Accounts, Sales and Marketing. I'm also one of the senior consultants at the Audience Agency. For the purposes of audio description, I'm a white woman in her 40s with blonde hair, wearing glasses, and I've got a headset on. I've also got a blurred background.
And a bit of a halo from the light
Have I
behind me.
got a halo? I'll adjust my laptop.
No, halos are good. Fantastic. So yes, so we'll be talking about travel and transport and related factors, which is a topic that's quite dear to my heart because briefly in amongst working on audience research, I did spend 6 months working on public transport research, and so it occurred to me that there's a whole load of particularly secondary data sets that are produced by Department for Transport and most other people, but we don't often use in the arts, but actually are really rich, really useful. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the stuff that comes out of those, as well as various other bits of evidence and information that could be handy. So first things first was think about, well, why are we talking about this document at all, apart from the fact that I get very excited by it, which is a bit of a good reason. But really, for me, it comes down to three things. It's about environmental approaches to engaging audiences. It's about equity, and I'll explain why in a sec. And it's about a whole load of things to do with practicalities for audiences. So on the environmental side, it's worth noting that transport is over a quarter of the UK's greenhouse emissions. So it's or carbon emissions. So it's a really significant factor. And as we'll see in a sec, traveling for leisure and entertainment is one of the few purposes of traveling that is increasing as opposed to decreasing amongst, I guess, travel for people as opposed to things, I guess. And to note that Julie's Bicycle are on record as saying that audience travel accounts for a large proportion of carbon impact of cultural venues. So in that sense, if we as a sector are going to address this issue, we probably do need to address transport. But also in terms of equity, where we're thinking of travel and transport, I will be talking a little bit about cars as well as public transport. But in terms of those who aren't using cars, it's a relatively smaller proportion. It's about a fifth of the UK's households, but it's much more heavily concentrated amongst lower income groups, also amongst particularly Black and British groups, but also people of mixed ethnicity and what defined as other ethnicities, and also much more concentrated in terms of public transport use amongst younger people. Perhaps not a surprise, but sort of almost 4 times the concentration of their proportion of journeys by 17 to 20-year-olds as opposed to to those in older middle age groups. So catering effectively for public transport becomes a way of catering more effectively for a broad population. And the third thing is just about the whole load of practicalities that transport bring with them. So looking at the participation survey from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, they list a range of reasons why people might have barriers to engaging with the arts. And some of those are things which it's relatively difficult for anyone to do anything about. And just to say, we will share these slides in case that'll be helpful later on. So some of them are really difficult to do anything about. People just aren't that interested, or they don't have time, or they have challenges with their health, or whatever. Some of those you can do things about, but particularly some of the things where there's a really clear action you can take. You can change the pricing if the expense is an issue. You can share more and better information if people don't know what's on. But next up on that list was about things being difficult to get to. So anything that can be done around transport is going to hit some quite key barriers for people. It's also true to say, without getting too into the detail of it, that people care about parking really quite a lot. And all sorts of factors, talking about access to parking being a barrier for various different people and motivations for some people to or to travel to certain venues or not, based on the availability and type and whatever of parking. I've been and have a bit of a look on the Association of what's it called? The Association of Car Parks, British Parking Association's website. So you don't need to. But there's lots and lots of things on there about exactly how excited people get by parking. So there's a whole lot of practicality issues there, but also a lot of it is changing. And one of the main things I'll talk about today is some of the key shifts that are happening in terms of transport use, some of which may be more surprising than you might think, or at least more extreme than you might think in terms of how they've changed. At least they were a little bit of a surprise to me, even though I had a bit of a hunch what the general trend might be. Also worth noting that it's this sector is evolving and there's new information all the time. There's literally a new big national report on bus journeys that came out this morning, which we've not dwelt on because it came out at midnight. But if you're looking into more about this topic, that might be a good place to follow up. So really, there's two main things I'm going to talk about. One is about the long-term trends in terms of people's travel use, and how that might be a little bit different from what you might expect. And then there's something about specific to buses and some of those changes. So the National Travel Survey, done by the Department of Transport, is a very large, very rich resource, but it includes data that I've summarised here. So essentially, this is per individual how many trips they make a year. And overall, you see that red line, people are making fewer journeys now than they used to 30 years ago. So that's kind of like an interesting thing, I think, in general, when we talk about, how out and about do people tend to be, sort of the idea of sort of walk-up audiences, etc. There is less general travel going on overall. But what there is more of happening is more travel for purposes of entertainment and sort of outdoor public activities. So if you look at that blue line there, that's tracking the relative number of trips compared to 1995 for entertainment, sort of entertainment and leisure, really. And you can see it kind of it went up in the early 2000s. It dipped again when you hit the recession. It then continued to climb through the 2010s, dropping heavily for COVID, even more heavily than for general all purposes, and then bouncing back. And we would expect that to kind of keep bouncing back. One of the other lines you see in grey in the background that has really increased is day trips as well. So more people, or people are taking more day trips than they used to, even while all those sort of, most of their other uses of transport are declining. So that's kind of maybe a curious thing. But if they are taking day trips, they tend to be more local. So on average, they're sort of a third more local than they used to be, if that makes sense. So more day trips happening, but they're not that far from home. So if you're thinking about where to attract audiences from for a day trip audience, it's smaller than it used to be. But yeah, more of it. We also can see, if you look at how far people are traveling and how often they're traveling, that people are traveling slower. So basically, they're spending as much time traveling as they always did, but maybe getting less far in that time. So that about 12% slower. And of course, we all go out there and think, well, roads seem to be really busy. So why is that? If overall volume's dropping, it's because the number of people have gone up. So if each person is doing fewer trips, there are more people, the net result is more trips, which is also partly why trips are slower. So if that's the overall picture about why people are traveling, we can look at how they're traveling. And I've grouped this into sort of a few different sets. The first one is about local buses, which you can see has dropped even more than general all-mode travel has dropped, particularly in the last 10 years, maybe sort of 8 years. where we've seen a real kind of drop off. So that there's been 42% less trips by bus per person than there were in 2002. So in the space of 2 decades, that's quite a big slump. Particularly when you see how sharp that last bit of the curve has been. Of course, one of those years is, one or two of those years is COVID related and it's pushing it down quite heavily. But overall, you can see it's just sliding and sliding and sliding, and we'll see why in a bit. Car and car as a passenger has also dropped, but cars have dropped less than average, which is notable because it's the single largest way that people travel around, of course. Quite substantially, if you look at the summary here. But what's notable really is that fewer people are travelling by as a passenger in a vehicle compared to before. And if you look at the overall figures, you can see that there are more cars per household now than there have ever been. So essentially, the number of carless households has dropped, and the number of two-car households has increased by the same amount. So you're seeing basically more people have the chance of taking their own cars to go to their own place on their own. So there's more of those journeys happening and fewer of the ones where people are riding with other people. Of course, many of these trends are not exactly what you would look for from an environmental perspective, but there it is. Look at active travel. You can see that walking as a means of travel has gone down, by almost a third. And cycling is a little bit up, but despite a really big surge in the pandemic, it's now not that much further up than it previously had been, which I think if you compare that to some other countries and some other kind of trends we see is perhaps a little disturbing, a little bit concerning. But again, it could be an area where there is potential for people to do more, and for there to be maybe sort of greater provision of bike racks and maybe showering facilities and changing or various different ways we can make it easier for people to cycle. And then the final one is there's a greater reliance on trains. So train journeys have increased really substantially for the last 20 years, even though train prices keep going up. And every time that happens, people say, oh, it costs too much, it'll put people off going. It does put people off a bit, but nonetheless, trains in general are proving very popular. So what we can do with this is take a little bit of a peek across at what we've seen in audience audience answer surveys, and we see a broadly equivalent picture in terms of the overall proportions of people travelling by different methods. So loads of people travelling by car, a small proportion travelling by bus, and then fewer by on foot and fewer by train. And I guess the train, if you looked back, so for 10, 20 years, an equivalent way to this, that percentage probably would be a bit lower as well. But still, very, very heavy car reliance still amongst audiences, as we can see. It is worth saying that's not a core question in audience answers, so it's not asked by everyone that's in audience answers. So it is probably worth getting your own picture individually to get a sense of what's going on and who is travelling by that mode. But as we can see, given that car owners or car owning households tend to skew white, affluent, and middle aged, that probably reinforces a tendency we see in cultural audiences to fit those same categories as well. Okay, so if that was a bit of a run through of the very, very long term picture in terms of what's happening, in terms of how people are behaving in terms of travel and transport, is something which is a bit more recent, but also more specific in terms of the impact on buses. So I don't know about you, but I'd always had a bit of a suspicion that they're not quite as many buses around as they used to be. I'm sure that the service has been thinned out a bit. I wonder, how bad it is. And there was some research produced by the Friends of the Earth with the University of Leeds, where they looked at timetables across the country, split out by local authority, for how many bus services there were at different times of day and in different places, to look at what the overall change has been. And so I was thinking, yes, they're likely to be a little bit down. Chances are, because we've seen bus use drop 42%, so probably it would have dropped a fair bit. But I was thinking maybe there's more buses running a little bit more empty because there's, people are traveling on the bus less, but actually it doesn't appear to be what's happening because the frequency of services has dropped by an enormous proportion across most parts of the country, across most times of the day, to really to me, quite a stark extent. So, we're talking about between a half and two-thirds of bus services no longer running since 2008, across large straight stretches of the country. The big standout exception is London, where there are more services overall, and that's particularly true of outer London. But across big swathes of the rest of the country, Wales, East Midlands, North East, Yorkshire and Humber, pretty much across the board, 50% or more cut in bus services. So, of course, where we're seeing smaller drops than that, but still very significant drops in usage, and it's probably what's driving it. But this picture isn't completely uniform. And the reason I flag that is that there is a neat little mapping tool they've got where you can zoom in on any given local authority and say, okay, so how many bus services were there an hour before? How many bus services are there an hour now? And you can see that there are broad trends, but certain places stick out more than others. So, for example, West Berkshire is really low. Oxfordshire is actually up a bit. Outer London, really high. But other pockets on the East Coast also doing pretty well. Large swathes of the Midlands and the North, much lower. And I've highlighted Staffordshire Moorlands here, as previously mentioned, as being sort of an exceptionally steep cut in provision. So you can see how if you're looking at audiences in certain areas or coming from certain places, the ability of certain types of people to get around, to get from A to B, will be severely curtailed based on this. And you can obviously look into the figures to see, is it particular times of day, is it very particular concentrated areas, and use that as a bit of a guide for what's going on and what other support and facilities might be useful. Or indeed, in some cases, whether it's worth lobbying local MPs, local councils, local mayors to say, for us, it's really important there's a train available after 10 o'clock at night because otherwise people coming out to the show can't get home or whatever. So I think it's something it's worth being aware of as kind of like a thing that will shape audience behaviour really quite significantly. If you want to zoom in on your own area, there's a link there that you'll be able to go and have a look at in more detail. So, what does it all mean? Well, Zoe will give us a few thoughts and reflections. For me, I think it calls out a few things. One is, I think there's some really interesting environmental challenges about how we do support a wide range of ways of people attending, and what we can do to maximise that. Is about easily sharing information? Is it about incentives and discounts and partnerships? And that doesn't need to be about giving away money exactly. It could be a partnership with a bus company where you get free advertising on the bus in order to encourage people to use it, or a range of different possibilities. But that is not only an environmental concern, but it's also about equity and it's about access and diversity. There's a whole load of practicalities that come with it in terms of where people can and can't come from, how that will have been changed by this environment. Have there been shifts that will have affected which audiences can come to you, which maybe haven't been as obvious internally until you actually start thinking, oh, actually, is the reason we get fewer people from there because that service has just stopped? Whatever, so worth being aware of all that. And of course, there's different ways we can help with this kind of information in terms of there's standard questions in audience answers about which particular mode people are taking, but there's also a catchment mapping tool that's built into that. Equally, if you want to do more bespoke things, things that are more granular in terms of how that mapping is, how that area is shaped, which particular areas it's coming from, how it relates to an overlay of transport options, etc. That's also something we can look at. We've done some research for some organisations where they've either been doing feasibility or just analysis of their audience and said, okay, let's literally map the transport networks and see how it relates to who's coming. Or indeed find out from people what are the barriers, what are the things that would make that work for them better. We're doing some research in the Cultural Participation Monitor about event times and or whether galleries stay open later, which I suspect will have some bearing on public transport use as well. in terms of people maybe wanting things to finish earlier so they can get home. So the bus service information, we'll share it on the slides, but essentially, if you Google Friends of the Earth bus map, it'll come up. That's probably the quickest way, but otherwise it'll be there on the slide. Yes, so that's a bit of a run through of the sort of big picture. How is some sources of information, some ways you can sort of see how some of these behaviours are shifting. But I will pass over to Zoe for reflections on what does that mean.
Thanks, Ollie. It was really interesting, and I wrote a few things down actually as we were talking. One of the things that sprang to mind, I think it was similar to you just saying about galleries and whether event times may assist people being able to get home earlier. I noticed that National Theatre are starting some earlier performance times, so they're trialing the 6:30 performance start times. Obviously, they're based in London, so it's for slightly different reasons. Their audience have requested that, I suspect, because they want to be able to get out of London on kind of later running train services and things like that. But it just made me think that whether that might become a kind of something that other organisations might be interested in piloting to see whether there is appetite and to see actually whether that might increase the ability for people to be able to use public transport in order to leave events. I know certainly reflecting on my own experience, I live in Stoke-on-Trent, so we're in between Birmingham and Manchester. We do have a cultural offer within the city, which we're very limited. You have to really have a car really to get to. And the bus services stop running at about 8 o'clock at night. But actually, just to get into the bigger city centres, the train services coming back into the area stop running at 9 o'clock. So really, what that means is you are left to either needing to book an overnight stay, which is quite expensive, or really having to use a car, which is really frustrating if you are conscious and wanting to reduce your kind of car travel time. It also just made me think, about the cost, some of the barriers that you experience in using a car going into a city. The costs of a parking are normally very, very expensive. And it also might mean that you are less likely to, I don't know, pay for a drink in the bar because actually in reality you can't do that driving home. So actually it's having an impact on secondary spend potentially within the venues that you might be visiting. So I think all of these things kind of come together, and there's a knock-on effect effectively in your mode of travel to an organisation. The other thing that took me back, we did some research. It was pre-COVID around audiences in Birmingham. We did some consultation with community members who were non-traditional arts attenders. They tended to stay fairly closely to their kind of local area and had really good use of things like some of the free service provision like libraries and things like that, but trying to encourage them to leave their local area and travel into the city centre, even though they may only be 3 or 4 miles away, using the bus actually caused quite a lot of travel anxiety. And it's maybe something that we don't always factor in for our audiences, especially those who might be less familiar with our venues. But what we were hearing from them basically was saying that, they were really worried about what bus stop to get on and off at. And then they were really then worried about how they got from that bus stop to the organisation that was inviting them in. And they were just had a lack of confidence around it. And I think that we shouldn't necessarily sort of dispel the fact that that's something that, audiences are feeling when they're coming maybe to our venue for the first time. Added to the pressure of using public transport. And we also heard things about personal safety as well and actually coming out into kind of bigger cities at night. So, we might sort of imagine that those are things that people perhaps aren't always kind of feeling, but they were certainly things that we were hearing back in that research that we did. As I say, that was pre-COVID and things may have changed since then. The final thing I just wrote down was there was something really interesting about active travel. There's a big push in lots of local authorities around active travel, trying to get more people walking, cycling, using cycle routes. But actually, as organisations, quite often we're quite limited in terms of what facilities we can offer for people, maybe to park a bike safely, or, if maybe people wanted access to a shower. These are all things that, if you were going into a workplace that you might have access to. But actually, if you're going for, going for a day out to a museum or a historic property, or perhaps going into a theatre, you're not necessarily going to want to potentially do. But I was thinking about whether there were opportunities for organisations to run partnerships with those active travel schemes, really to try and encourage it and really to try and understand whether there might be opportunity to increase that. Certainly locally to me, there's provision at the moment for things like bicycle repair and building people's confidence to ride a bicycle on kind of main roads. But there might be opportunity, for example, for you to do some work with those active travel schemes in your area. So it's definitely worth finding out about them and maybe a bit more about what's going on. My final question was a question back to Ollie, actually, if that's okay, Ollie. It's an easy one. Well, I think it is, but maybe it's your view. But I wondered, there was one of the slides there where you showed the changes really since the kind of recession in the early 2000s. Obviously, we'd had a dip with COVID, but I'm wondering kind of whether or not there's going to be an impact around cost of living, because it really feels like cost of living is really hitting organisations at the moment, and whether or not we're expecting to see a sort of dip or a decline in people traveling specifically for entertainment based on the cost of living currently. You're on mute, so you might need, yeah.
Um, Interesting question. I think yes is the short answer. It's essentially cost of living plus or sort of functioning a bit like a recession. You would expect to see a bit of that dip happening. Although I think the background trend is upwards overall, so maybe it'll be less high than it would have been, but not necessarily down. You see what I mean? I think the fact that there are more people with access to a car individually means that probably it's easier for people to make more of those trips without being dependent on other people in the household. So I think that's probably taking away some of the constraints in terms of travel patterns. Um, I was going to say though, you mentioned links to active travel schemes, and I think Hereford Courtyard did something similar. There's a case study on the Julie's Bicycle website. So again, that might be a useful place to have a look for more examples of things that people have done. But I was also reminded when you're talking about traveling with groups, that Birmingham example, that of course one of the differences between public transport and private vehicles is that the cost goes up largely proportionate to the number of people you're taking. So again, it could put pressure on group sizes and sort of encourage smaller groups if people are finding public transport relatively more expensive. So that's maybe another thing to factor in. But yes, I noticed there's a couple of things in the chat, so I'm just going to have a quick peek at those. Will the sorry, yes, yes, there will be a link. There'll be a recording, and we'll share the slides as well. There's some other resources. And yes, interesting comment on the early starts thing. Bad tempered piece in the Times about saying it's impossible for workers. I think that is it. It is an awkward trade-off, but I think the thing that I find interesting is the extent to which there are kind of industry-wide standards for when people start. And when you think actually how varied different audience groups are, you think you'd sort of expect different venues to have different times that they settle on the work for different people, and that goes with a different product, or it goes with a different experience, all sorts of other elements of the event. And we are seeing, I think, post COVID, we've seen a dip in older audiences for later events. So it does seem like we've seen our older audiences dipping in general, but it's particularly, actually the matinees are holding up relatively well. So again, that might be another thing to factor in, albeit
it's an interesting one. I think the earlier start times. I think you're absolutely right, Ollie. It has to be around your audience and your offer. There's also something about a sort of slight catching up of the wider hospitality industry around that. So quite often where there's things like pre-event dining options or kind of particular places that audiences might go. Obviously, a lot of their kind of staffing and offer are kind of geared towards particular start times. So if you are thinking as an organisation to potentially pilot something like that, it might also be worth thinking about the wider infrastructure around you and kind of what the impact might have on them.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also something which I've not got hard evidence to prove, but I have as a very strong hunch. is that there is a level of frequency below which public transport drops when the type of engagement people have with it becomes totally different. Um, so, and I particularly find it when I'm chatting to friends and family in London, where you just turn up at a stop and a bus comes. Like you don't have to think about what time is the bus. That's like a meaningless question. You just turn up and there's a bus. Um, Whereas once frequency drops below a certain level, whether that one bus is on time, what exact time is it, etc., starts to become crucial. And that's where that anxiety thing that you touched on, I think, is a really interesting concept, that kind of travel anxiety, starts to kick in, and it starts to make it not only more difficult, but actually just less of a pleasurable experience. To think, oh, well, I'll just do this thing, it'll be nice, and then I'll have to worry about things on the way out, and I have to worry on the way back, and
Yeah.
that just feels like hard work.
Yeah, I think things like certainly we trialed things like visual maps. So where you can have kind of something at the so if somebody got up at a certain bus stop, you could have something which basically shows them each step in a visual image to get them to your
Mm.
venue. So they have something which they can use, which is really reassuring. Because obviously you can't have necessarily a member of staff stood at the bus stop to lead people through to your venue, but you can do something which supports people in terms of documenting what that might look like for them. So I think there are things that you can do to try and lessen that anxiety for people. But of course, it still is, it may be still too much for some groups. And it might be that you're looking at different audience development initiatives in order to support them attending your venue for the first time. So something like a supported visit with a group might be a better option for them where you are arranging the transport. But of course, that adds additional cost often to the project that you're delivering.
Like, and then there's the legacy thing about, does it then become that they can sustainably do themselves? Yeah. So a couple of comments in the chat. Health patterns have an impact, absolutely. People are encouraged to go to sleep at regular times and do want late nights less and less. That will be a very early start. That's probably is true. I think one of the things that struck me is that walking dropping as a mode of transport, because in a way that cuts against the idea. If you're trying to be personally healthy, that's a really good way of getting lots of exercise built into the day. But of course, the built environment often discourages it, or isn't sort of really set up to make that easy. And I suspect that's something which is also just impacted by a lot of the kind of COVID hangover that people are experiencing in lots of different ways. Yeah, it's an interesting one. And what about London? Any particular reflections on London travel stats, apart from being very grateful for amazing public transport? So yes, treasure it. You're very, very lucky. It's also not an accident. There's a amazing graph I always put in here as a little extra bonus, which shows the number of passenger journeys for London and for other UK cities since deregulation. And essentially, London was allowed to run its own transport, and nowhere else was, and passenger numbers collapsed across the rest of the country, but they rose in London. So but it's a really, really stark picture. I think one of the things is that the network reaches out, the bus network reaches out further in London now than it did. So again, that probably sort of enlarges catchments or makes it slightly easier to get to certain places. So that's probably worth bearing in mind. Not to mention wonderful things like Crossrail, etc., which are also doing wonders. I'll be that bit. I didn't sort of into a particular regional one. A Vancouver reflection. An extra late night ferry from a Beyonce concert in Vancouver. That sounds blissful, doesn't it? Do a concert and then get the ferry across the brilliant. Made all the difference to people living there. They could attend the show without staying overnight. Yes, yes. No, that sounds very true. And there was somewhere recently where they were looking at Cardiff. They had an extension planned for the so that they could queue up lots of trains to take people away from Millennium Stadium.
Yeah. And we certainly did a piece of feasibility work in Swansea where they were looking at building a new significant large arena venue, and really a lot of the negotiation was with transport providers in order to make sure there was a high enough volume of transport operators that could take audiences away in an efficient manner, because people don't want to be waiting kind of 2 hours for a connection. So it was really, really important again to be able to kind of that exit was a crucial part of the overall visitor experience, and actually making sure that people, that's not the ending of their night where they're kind of waiting, seeing whether they might be able to get home or not. That's a really important step in the overall customer journey.
Yes, yes. and mass transit is really the way to to do that on any significant scale, probably. Which I guess is the advantages of places like Birmingham as a kind of events location, whereas somewhere like Leeds does still struggle because it doesn't have the mass transit. Um, so yes, does anyone have any reflections or questions, either by the chat or if they want to speak up and jump in? In the meantime, I'll try and think of what else might be useful to say specific to London. Apart from haven't you got a nice new tube map, and the sort of the new lines distinguished in a really helpful way. But I think in a strange way, that's a good example of the way that how things are communicated and how people are informed about the options. You know, they've done this massive exercise because they think communicating it better will increase the travel use. And I guess as cultural organisations, there's probably an equivalent kind of shift to say, actually, is there a way of simplifying it to go, if you're coming from the north of the city, you want the bus number blah. If you want coming from the east of the city, you want the bus number blah. And that's kind of just to simplify it for people so they're not looking at all the possible options. A new initiative in Chichester. Could you describe that very briefly? That's Megan, is it?
It was. I was totally butting in there. Yeah, no, I noticed that Chichester are doing. I grew up in Chichester, so I know the town quite well. But the theatre are putting on basically a dedicated bus service to get people home after the show, and I think that's going to be quite important, given it's an older population, it's a rural area for the most part. So getting people home. Just really interested. I'd be really curious to talk to them and see how they're finding that develop for sure.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea.
And I was thinking, Ollie, as well, just in terms of a festival, so again, different art form, there is a large ceramics festival that takes place in Stoke-on-Trent every 2 years. And at different festival stages, they've tried festival transport to get people around to different sites because the programme is fairly dispersed. So again, thinking about the visitor profile, there was a high number of people who come from outside the area, usually quite a high proportion on train actually attending that particular event, don't necessarily have the means to get around or the knowledge to get around the city very easily. So again, there was a trial with festival transport basically to take people around at kind of peak times in the festival, which was really popular at the time. I think due to some budgetary kind of cuts, that hasn't been something they've been able to continue. But I know certainly from evaluating that project, a lot of the participants who used that transport were really grateful for it. It improved their experience overall of the festival and enabled them to see more of the programme.
And I suspect that kind of almost like infrastructure type development relies on people being familiar with it over multiple years to really embed as a kind of, I know I can go there because we tried it once and it was worth the risk, and now we'll do it regularly and feel comfortable. And yeah. Interesting. Greenfield Festival's been offering festival and coach tickets, yes, and ring fence portal tickets for those travelling by bus. Ring fencing tickets is a particularly interesting one. So not just saying there's an incentive or there's a higher cost for parking than there's just walking, coming in by public transport. Because places like the Eden Project, obviously they have different ticket prices based on travel mode, but actually saying X% of attendees will be people who travel by this mode is quite an interesting way of doing it. So yes.
Oh.
Go on.
I have a question here. Oh yeah. I'm just wondering about how, if there's like research into how free transit for children, like I'm thinking in certain areas there's sort of a cutoff. I think here it's now kids 12 and under get to ride public transit for free. Is there any research or thoughts on how that impacts the visitor experience?
I don't know of particular evidence, but I mean, intuitively, it feels like it probably does make quite a difference. Partly because I think you normally would expect to get free travel below the age of 5, I think. Because otherwise, I guess, the overall cost of trips, etc., needs to start to mount up once you sort of, multiple people getting multiple tickets and also getting multiple travel tickets, etc. And I guess that's probably something as well, which otherwise there's quite a strong push towards traveling by car. Because if you're going to pay multiple tickets and doing stuff with kids is a bit stressful anyway, then the car just lets you go where you need to go and just go from there. So yeah, so I don't know is the short answer. We are asking in the participation monitor some questions around, well, we ask questions about the family composition and where people like to go and whether people are travelling further afield or not than they have been. It might be that if we ask specifically around travel options in future, that might be another way to unpick that a bit. But certainly we do tend to see age of children being a differentiator in terms of engagement patterns. So we will share the slides from this and some other useful links with a follow-up message. Hopefully, if had your interest piqued by various bits of this, you think actually let's look at the more local zoom on this particular factor, or maybe just think through a little bit about what this might mean for my local area or particular audience groups that you're reaching, then that will give you a place to start. We will then be another tea break session next month on the 10th of April, looking at something in and around the topic of creative places. So looking at sort of local areas and where people are going and maybe some of the things that are drawing them to engage in a particular area as opposed to elsewhere. So more details on that, but from the absolutely fresh data from the Cultural Participation Monitor, which has just come back but hasn't even been inputted and coded yet. So that will be our first sort of chance to share some of those findings as well. So hopefully that'll be interesting too. So thanks for coming along and see you next time.